Bigfoot at Black Creek by Mason Winfield. Chapter 12 of A Ghost Hunter's Journal. Tales of the Supernatural and the Strange in Upstate New York. By now, the word paranormal is used simply to mean outside the accepted theory, and as might be imagined, the modern business of it is a big one, concerning itself partly with subjects that people would type as supernatural, like apparitions of dead humans and extrasensory talents in living ones. Paranormal inquiry also addresses things that might be totally natural, even commonplace, but simply out of setting. Ancient mysteries, like the possible Phoenician exploration of the Americas, are generally of this variety. Some paranormal subjects may just be undiscovered, like UFOs, earth energies, and mysterious monsters, and if the general presumptions of their advocates come true, might someday be the study of mainstream disciplines like physics, geology, and zoology. The apish giant, often called Bigfoot, would be in the last category, and Shadows of the Western Door address the subject of its possible presence in western New York. I compiled as many good crazy critter reports as I could about my home region, hoping for credible and electrifying close encounters. What surfaced easily was a folkloric mass from a long section of the Alleghenies running well into Pennsylvania. Until recently, this was the best modern cycle, but it was murky, often third-hand reports lacking reliable witnesses or physical evidence. At that point, it didn't surprise me. I expected the critters to be scarce. From 1973 to 1976, there was a better cycle of reports from a largely forested and rural region around the northern part of Allegheny County. I had interviewed most of the key human players from this episode in the early 90s, and they seemed very credible. But I'd left the matter out of Shadows because I didn't have enough idea what was up to even know which chapter to put it in. Ghosts? Beasties? UFOs? From what I could gather, the focus, if not also the stimulus of the quirky activity, seemed to be a small cabin built by some high school kids near a marshy region that had attracted generations of paranormal rumors reminiscent of UFO stories, like strange lights and mechanical noises. The lads used to sleep in this jerry-rigged shack on weekends and holidays, but one of them stepped outside one night and found himself and a large critter checking each other out. He described it as anthropoidal, but light-colored. In other respects, the cycle followed paranormal patterns: ripped farm animals, rattled cabins, spooked livestock, alarmed country folk, and reports of strange, smelly critters. Yes, Bigfoot is supposedly so redolent that they call him the skunk ape in some parts. Shortly after Shadows was published, I started hearing stories that made me believe I'd given too short shrift to a couple of its topics, including Old Stinky. In the fall of 1998, after a luncheon talk in Niagara County, I was approached by one of the attendees. That very week, her brother's family had cast a set of 17-inch footprints outside their Allegheny County home. They were wary of publicity, but I managed to arrange an interview for a few weeks later. I used the interval for a little more digging and reflected on Bigfoot in my area back through time. There were historic accounts of Bigfoot, or the reasonable facsimile. One of the most elaborate came from Livingston County, where a strange beast was sighted several times in 1870 and 1871. Big, bipedal, and hairy, it maimed a number of harassing dogs. The accounts make no mention of details we'd consider critical: its skull size and shape, its body configuration. It's hard to know what was going on. As part of the work on Buried Secrets, Shadows chapter on the ancient mysteries of the region, I had discovered a tradition of something like Bigfoot in the histories and old records. When the whites arrived for good near the end of the 18th century, this area was fairly dotted with earthworks, much like the Old World type, and a number of curiosities came out of them, including two bestial, humanoid skulls from a pre-Iroquoian burial mound on Tonawanda Island near Buffalo. Giant human-like skeletons turned up throughout the region, chiefly in the southern tier near the Alleghenies and along river valleys like the Conewango. More reports of big hominid bones came from home builders and other diggers near East Aurora and Rochester. 19th century finds, seemingly quite well documented, of numerous giant skeletons just outside western New York, in northern Pennsylvania and the Susquehanna Valley, could point to a tribe, even a race of them in the region, except for the sheer oddity of the idea. While some Native American nations of the West seem to have the tradition of the Bigfoot, among those of the Northeast woodlands, the matter is anything but clear. Iroquois legend held figures that might be interpreted as Bigfoot-like, both generic, the stone giants, and individual, like Hi-Hat, a bogey local to the northern Alleghenies. I'd even heard of something called the Wendigo complex, only found among Native American men, in which the sufferer believes he is becoming something bestial, cannibalistic, and dangerous to his community, even his own loved ones. Yet I had no confidence whatever that a Bigfoot was what we were talking about. I don't believe you should start out looking for something and ransack tradition for things that remind you of it. You don't understand the significance of the images that way. You start by getting into the context of a culture, and I really didn't think I was with the native people of the Northeast. It was an exceptionally mild October afternoon when I arrived at the home of Bill Pasquarella and Sandy Steffen. Bill was a strong, red-bearded fellow, perpetually dressed in jeans and flannels, a wood sculptor whose studio was in Wellsville. He traveled frequently about our region on various jobs, and though he was obviously a firm presence about the household, he seemed to be a bystander to its social life and much of the decision-making. Sandy was a 30-something hippie, a free-thinking, long-haired artist who watched their brood of kids ranging from 5 to 20 and ran a gallery out of their house. With input from the kids, Sandy gave me the particulars. They'd heard funny noises outside their rural house one moist night the week before. No one had anything more specific. I got the feeling that there was something atmospheric, possibly even subliminal, about their perceptions. The next morning, they saw the footprints in the wet soil and made impressions of the best, too. Presuming hopefully that the big fellow's a vegan, they put bowls with a variety of fruit and bread on the porch that night. In the morning, they found the edibles uneaten, though moved, as if picked up and examined. Strangest of all, a mirror, a heavy old job that took strength to move, had been taken from their porch a dozen yards to a small grove and was left resting behind a tree in a position that could have reflected the light from the house, as if the unknown woodsman was fascinated by it, or his own image. One of the kids reported that something in the orchard had dropped a behemoth biohazard, of which I'm pleased to say no plaster impressions were made. For the evening of our interview, an informal signing and reception had been arranged at Sandy's living room shop. I enjoyed her granola cruncher friends and got a batch of new leads on the local paranormal for her Shadow's eventual follow-up. Sandy's boys and girls were well underfoot. A 16-year-old pack of anxieties named Parker was the image of my younger self, distrustful of authority figures like I must have at that point seemed. Evidently, I passed the test, for within seconds of our first exchange of words, the compact, sandy-haired, buzz-cut fellow was spilling those details of his life. His girlfriends, his fistfights, his wisecracks to teachers that he thought put him in the best light. He focused on me as if only he and I were in the room, talking for a minute or two, then circulating off with his sidekick Jake, and returning later expecting my full attention for his every observation, no matter what stage of talk I was at with someone else. Jake, an affable widebody introduced as a poet, offered to send me his own work for review, which would have been fine. I always try to encourage writing in kids. Parker tried to talk him into reciting one of the bombshells that had impressed their circle, but he declined. He'd send me something, though. The late drive home on those spare country roads gave me a chance to step back from the Black Creek situation. My first gesture was to take a breath. The Allegheny Bigfoot was something new for me all the way. Most of the cases I work with involve psychic, supernatural phenomena, which are never so concrete or dramatic that there's a chance of official acceptance. Thus, there had never been much for me to gain or lose by them. The prospect of getting the goods on this one made me nervous. I tried to slow down and evaluate the case for its legitimacy. This was the most persuasive 20th century encounter I'd ever heard of in western New York, and one of the only Bigfoot appearances anywhere reported in an area this accessible. Northern Allegheny County is hilly, wooded and rural, but you'd be hard-pressed to find a spot in it more than a mile from a paved road. The region is crossed by hunters, hikers, and ATVs virtually all year. It was maddening to think of a big unknown animal living hidden here for very long. The plaster footprints had looked imposing enough. Blocky, brute affairs much like the ones from California and the Northwest. It was impressive to see and heft them, as if their mineral quality indicated their maker. Of course, a woodcarver like Bill Pasquarella could have done the models for them, but he was one of the skeptics. And what would have been the motive? The family were trying to keep things quiet, and they were far from united in their belief. Sandy and some of the older kids were serious about the natural mystery, though to the younger ones, passing around chalky footprints like family treasures, the Sasquatch Watch was clearly a game at this point. Husband Bill and college student Susie had never caught the obsession, both seeming to feel that the family were the victims of a joker in the matter of the footprints and overactive imaginations thereafter. I drew no conclusion from this disparity. Even in some famous and apparently legitimate paranormal cases, members of a family don't always agree about the situation under their own roof. Had Sandy's entire clan been trying to persuade me of something, I would have been even more suspicious. One thing even had me questioning Sandy's belief. I know she's a tree hugger, but why, after taking its footprints, would anyone who believes in its existence invite this creature back near her children? This is a massive animal, or whatever, and because of its presumed intelligence, potentially the most dangerous in the world. Then I thought of the UFO freaks in Independence Day, imploring their own incineration from atop a high building. I know people who would do that. Brutally dismissive of other folks whose politics merely differ on points from their own, they can suspend all critical faculties with a UFO or an unknown animal, regarding any manifestation of either as a sacred event like the surfacing of an endangered whale. I reflected that anything is possible where people are concerned, and that my own attitudes were not above re-examination as well. I pondered my next concrete move. I wasn't sure there would be one. Whatever I am or think I am accomplishing, I never saw my role as that of a paranormal P.T. Barnum, calling ever more mystifying events to the world's notice. My point has always been to remind us of the great language embodied in the world's myth, religion, and spirituality. To protest this legacy's neglect in the late 20th century's materialism, and to point out for us all again that our scientific mindset has not proven its case well enough to rule out all but its own gods. The discovery and documentation of a Bigfoot in a western New York backyard had no direct impact on any of these goals. Most decisive, however, was the concerned family's desire for privacy. Any further publicizing on my part would be betraying them. I decided simply to wait, either for Sandy's clan to change its position or for another pertinent development I could write up without compromising any source. Because of my book and my new contacts in the region, I thought I'd have a fair chance of hearing about it. I resolved to prepare for it by solidifying a personal big picture about the whole topic. This was not a major scholarly undertaking, I might add. The literature is truly dense in almost no paranormal subject. I found that most devotees see the Bigfoot question as a zoological one, regarding the beastie as a presumed extant hominid, like Gigantopithecus. To them, the only problem is that the hunt so far has been unsuccessful. The rest of us, though, run into some dead ends looking at it that way. It's hard to see how the North American environment could support a still-secret breeding population of large animals, unless they eat trees and sleep underground. A Bigfoot still hasn't been shot, captured, or even found dead. There are counter-arguments and good evidence of Bigfoot's physical existence. Footprints, recorded sound effects, even a few unidentified reddish hairs. The sheer mass of testimony has to be worth something, pointing at least to a perceptual mystery. Almost every forested state of the Union has had Bigfoot reports throughout white history, and, at least in the West, Native American tradition. There is also that famous, short, amazing film. It could be a power forward in an ape suit except for its walk, which physiologists have pronounced as humanly impossible to fake. There are reasons to believe that the absence of a Bigfoot living or dead is not such crushing evidence. Its alleged environment is huge and trackless. A dead grizzly has never been found in the woods either, and many natural animals are marvelously elusive. Most people in my region, for instance, are unaware that coyotes live among us in abundance, even in the suburbs. Bears hide pretty well too, and they're lumbering and not as smart as hominids. The defiance of skeptics isn't so worrisome either. There have been these in every generation about every issue. They admit no doubt of the standard picture which changes if ever around them. The most credible position may be in the middle, especially for those who haven't done any digging. If you take only what's known about Bigfoot, that it has been reported, and then work backward, a number of insights make sense. Worldwide mystery critters, lake snakes like the Loch Ness Monster, and freaky furries like Bigfoot, Yeti, and others, have for some reason become associated both with the UFO cycle and the Earth mystery school of modern supernaturalism. There seem to be UFO beastie zones and even seasons about the world. For instance, the third week of May 1977 found the British Isles a supernatural circus of big cat and Nessie sightings with a veritable Star Wars big top of UFOs above. Researcher John Mitchell noted that most of the sightings were near places of ancient sanctity, old religious sites, and related geological features like geomagnetic electricity and underground water, also associated with hauntings. Philosophers of the paranormal have found a Jungian, as in psychoanalyst Carl Jung, significance to most of the apparitions too. Big snakes, big monkeys, and big discs in the sky are elements of such primal significance in the language of the unconscious that they would be likely things to imagine. It doesn't matter at all that the people who see them are unexposed to Jungian psychology. It's actually more persuasive that way. The upshot of all this philosophizing, though, is that I form no theory at all about Bigfoot. Evenly weighted in my mind were the possibilities that Bigfoot was connected to forces within the Earth, that it was some semi-physical mystery being totally new to science, possibly a supernatural wild card, the classic psychoid archetype, stepping from the collective unconscious in and out of the world, and that it and the whole business were make-believe. The prospect that Bigfoot could be a truly physical being was remote to me until my last 1998 visit to Allegheny County. I'd agreed to a mid-November signing at a small book and gift shop in the valley 30 minutes from Sandy Steffen's home. I was planning on dropping by Sandy's big old farmhouse in mid-afternoon, but was running late as usual, and by the time I arrived in her vicinity, I still had to get in my workout. I decided to take a run in the woods. I didn't know the trails around Sandy's home and couldn't afford to get lost, even off schedule, so I found a hilly stretch of logging path that took about 2 minutes to get up, and I did it a bunch of times, what I call a body workout, not a head one. One can become the other sometimes, but those long, big sky tours on just the right days are the ones you live for. I took my cross-country ski poles with me. I would be glad of it. The carbide tips, plain affairs without baskets made for roller skiing on the roads, clacked behind me on the rocks and dirt with each pushed-off time to a stride. I reflected on the recent Bigfoot reports from this immediate region, and couldn't help recalling that the national image of the big fellow varies from reclusive veggie to moody savage. Hunters stormed in their cabins, prospectors trapped in valleys, and even lonely campers dismembered figured in the accumulated lore. Great images to keep your company in the dimming woods. It looks dorky, but running with poles like that gets the arms involved and raises the heart rate nicely. It also takes weight off my chronically bad feet, which, by the mid-1990s, were so beat up from years of sports that I couldn't run hard enough normally to get a good workout. If time was limited and a run it had to be, that was the choice. I'd been plugging away at it for about 10 minutes when some crows stormed up about 50 feet away. My heart rear-ended my ribs. Those wings sounded like breaking bones. I was glad to know instantly what they were, but what made them take off? I was developing that nasty feeling of being watched. Whenever I passed a certain spot about the midpoint of my course, the bushes rustled, and I sensed a big, dark body crouching behind them. I recalled the many calm, credible people over the years who had reported impressions of things in the western New York woods. big, lumpish forms, exactly as a Bigfoot should look at the distances reported. I'd had impressions like that many times myself, and made absolutely nothing of them. I'm used to the woods. Around twilight, stumps and bushes at different depths around you can look animate when you jerk your head. I couldn't fight my own sensation, nevertheless, that something was stalking me, ranging out from that bush alongside me, just out of sight for the first 50 feet of my curving course in either direction. It was always back waiting for me as I passed that spot on the return swing, following me again within reach until it saw me stop and come back. It was pretty oppressive, leaving car and road behind each time and winding back up into the dimness toward that clump of bushes behind a maple. I was beginning to dread it. By my 10th time up, I fancied that whatever was there had sensed that this would be its last chance to make a move. Sure enough, as I passed the fated spot for the last trip down, something broke one of the branches as if it were pulling it aside for a spring. I snarled and dropped into a karate crouch, raising the poles like twin prongs, announcing that this potential dinner felt militantly indigestible. Ski poles are hardly weapons, though running with them I fear no dog. I can pop the tips up to business level in a thought, and the straps give excellent leverage for thrusts in any direction. Still, the metal point of each basketless tip is about a half-inch long, unlikely to stick further in a heavy onrushing body, or even to catch and splinter the pole into something really lethal. I glared down at the long fiberglass shafts at the crouching form I imagined in the bush, filled with the adrenaline of righteous anger. I even staggered them. If a monster grabbed the pole in nearest reach, the other was going into its throat. It'd serve it right for interrupting a law-abiding run. Something was waving above the apparently crouching form, and I snatched a glance upward. Intestines swayed from a branch 10 feet up. They had to be from an animal, though they looked big enough to be human. I cursed sourly. I was almost glad I didn't see them earlier. I might not have finished my workout. I sidestepped down the trail, as angry as I was afraid. Hearing no pursuit in the thick leaves and trees, I relaxed and ambled normally the last 100 yards. The feelings came back as I unlocked the car, at that point most vulnerable. I arrived at Sandy's house, still chuckling at myself over that comical little stand-down. I had probably outfaced a dyspeptic groundhog. Young Parker let me in and showed me the downstairs shower, looking like he had something on his mind. When I came out, Sandy and other members of the brood were back, rushing around like they were batting down the hatches against a storm.
"Don't go anyplace,"
she said, ushering her youngest up the stairs. "Parky shot a Woody," chirped the little one. "You should have been there," crowed Parker, but he looked like he was covering his feelings. An hour before, the young fellow had fired a shotgun at some suspicious bushes. The resultant bellow and heavy bipedal running had them believing that he had winged the Bigfoot. I wondered if that was the stalker I had envisioned on my run. Its scrub haunting style was certainly the same, and we had our explanation if it had turned nasty. Unusual, but not unreported, Bigfoot behavior. Parker even believed he had some blood samples and hair from the scene, which he seemed about to retrieve. I raised my hand before he could spring up the stairs. "Can it wait? I have a signing to get to." Sandy, however, was distressed at the idea of Big Feet on the warpath, and the house with only one adult. I almost said, what am I going to do, stick him with my ski poles? But, reflecting on how recently I'd been offering to do just that, I held my peace and considered options. There was no telling how long I'd have to wait until Bill Pasquarella returned, but I was determined not to stand up that little bookstore. They're the ones you want to show respect, and a signing could be the high point of their year. The cops wouldn't stay here all night on suspicion of Big Feet, but another idea came to me. I called Jim Lynn, a retired civil deputy who lived nearby. He had attended a couple of my talks and even helped me track down a ghost story in these parts a few years back. He arrived in 45 minutes with his brother-in-law, Bob Gorski, a state trooper, and Ed Gunther, a friend, hunter, and curiosity seeker. They were brawny, middle-aged men armed for game, and I had no more fears for the family. Parker seemed to have some new heroes, and when I left he was on the porch with them chattering about law enforcement. Signings, like lectures, are usually great opportunities to make research contacts, and this small one in the shop of a Black Creek woman was no different. I inquired about the local paranormal as well as the mystery critter population. I didn't mention the word Bigfoot for fear of getting whoppers delivered to order, but a few stories from the last century did offer themselves, and word that recent digging in the cellar of an old home on Sandy's Road had turned up giant bones. Sandy had kept that from me, or else she hadn't known. It was also pointed out that this was the Valley of the Lost Nation, the region from which a small Native American group just vanished from history with barely a trace, as if something had snatched them into the sky. What the hell was going on around here? I got back to Sandy's by 9:30 to find Jim Lynn and his pals jawing with Husband Bill at the kitchen table, praising Sandy's coffee and whole wheat cookies. The three guardians had been all over the ridge with the family dogs and noticed nothing out of the ordinary. Everyone's spirits had lightened. I felt as if I had gotten swept up in Sandy's mood earlier that evening, and that my haste to get to the signing had tag-teamed my normal reasoning processes. I was even questioning my experience in the woods. I'd seen nothing, really. It was generally believed that Parker had sunk buckshot into his own boogeymen, and that our suspicions were the stuff dreams are made of. I delivered something like a vernacular Puck's address at the end of Midsummer's Night to the lawmen, filled with genial remorse for wasting time in their busy lives. Veterans of many a fruitless material stakeout, and they were good sports about this failed paranormal one. It had even become the fashion of the evening to scoff at Bigfoot rumors. Some comedian among the bunch, I can't embarrass Bill Pasquarella by revealing who, screamed upon opening a closet as if a werewolf were inside. It was so far from his normal manner, everybody laughed. The evening now seemed so innocent that no one even noticed when Susie walked with a couple of the dogs out to the barn for an errand. She was taking her sweet old time about getting back, though. The others were hot into some topic, and I decided to see what she was up to. The minute I stepped from the house, I knew something was wrong. The dogs were in full throat behind the barn. How could we not have heard them? I had two choices: turn back into the house and sound a warning, or rush over immediately. For some reason, I chose the latter. Generations of owners had more or less connected the old farmhouse to the barn by an assortment of structures. A stable, pens, a tool shed, they all seemed afterthoughts, walls without roofs, workspaces without walls, interlocking them all to produce jagged passageways and open-air spaces. I cut around the buildings from the outside and the front of the house, followed the hubbub to the left of it. Expecting to see Susie as I rounded the corner, I was readying a phrase, "What's all the racket?" I never used it. It felt like I ran into a tree branch. I flew and fell in an awkward position, on my back across a stack of old doors beneath a low overhang. My hips were higher than my head, which may have been what kept me conscious. In the odd, crowded confines of the barn entrance, there were wooden fixtures and heavy items at all angles, and only moonlight pouring in. The shadow that loomed over me looked as wide as a refrigerator. It reached for me with an astonishing peace. Everything was slowed, as if the air had thickened into molten glass, and time into an invisible, permeating medium that even bogged thought. I had the impression of fingers thick and blunt as Twinkies groping for me in my awkward perch. Several of them brushed past my eyes, inches away, as if expecting to finger paint into a palette of human features, as if reaching for an image a foot closer. Whatever it was easily within reach of my legs or my waist, and could have hauled me from my space like a wheelbarrow. But it seemed to prefer my throat, and to have trouble finding it in the half-lit jumble of flat planes, of table edges and reclining doors. Its spatial awareness was not that of a human being. From where I lay, I put my feet high against the figure above me. Its torso felt hard as wood. It leaned into me as if amused, sensing something it ready to grab. I'm not a big man at all, but I'm fit and my legs are strong. Even as my knees flexed, bringing the figure closer, I had the absurd memory of a similar move in college, when I got my back against a guardrail outside Denison University's Bandersnatch and pushed a '67 Chevy out of a snowbank. The things that flash through you in the most desperate, speeded-up, slowed-down moments. The few life-and-death situations I remember have all been like that. With the same motion, but viciously and faster, I gave a perfectly timed shove with all I had when the figure was most unbalanced and my leverage was the best. The huge form shot back and up, hitting its head on the edge of an overhanging open attic floor beneath which it had been leaning to reach at me. The impact had to be awful. I was on my feet so fast it surprised me. As if it had been left there for me to grab, the haft of a tool on the edge of a bench came into my hand. It was an axe. I swung it sideways like a bat at a pitch and felt the hammer end land with a sick thwack on a neck and jaw and carry right through. It made me remember a discovery from an ancient battle. Some guy's jaw found 100 feet from his body, doubtless slung off him by a single handy blow. As I say, the things that flash through you. I was sure something like this had happened in the barn in which I stood, and that the form that had to be at my feet would spell the mystery for good. The tool fell from my hands, and I stood back, stunned against the wall, the impact of the brushing blow I had taken earlier starting to tell for the first time, or really settling in. I came to at the incredible sound of a shotgun from 5 feet away, and the insane din of several dogs too afraid to do more than just stand and yap. Jim Lynn had fired at something toward the tree line and stood next to me, staring in its direction. Whatever instincts the old lawman had been good ones. He had left the house within seconds of me, out a different door, and come around from the other side. He may have saved my life. Susie Pasquarella stood frozen beside us, having witnessed everything from behind a waist-high partition. I looked down and saw nothing but scuffed dirt. Amazing. That blow was the most vicious thing I had ever done. I think it would have dropped a bear. Others arrived, Bob Gorski with his pistol and Bill Pasquarella with a baseball bat. Sandy and the older children followed. We stood staring out into the night, suddenly weirder than we had ever accepted, staring as if the field and trees beyond was a screen upon which we had seen a film, so moving we could not rise from our seats until we had read all the credits. It had to be minutes before any of us spoke.